right, and this is another episode of Content Minded. It's been quite an interesting few weeks. Of course, everyone can't stop talking about the election and so forth, and recently there was this interview with Tucker and Martyr Made. I'm one of the few people Martyr Made actually follows. I can't believe it, so I always wanted to get him on the show. I know that he had this interest in doing an episode on Byung-Chul Han, but I guess, I don't know, maybe, I hope he's not too rich for my blood right now. But anyways, I wanted to do another mega episode since I figure that a lot of online history stuff, a lot of culture stuff is covered by Digital Archipelago and by the Computer Room, and a lot of the news stuff is covered by the Cole Report. Although I think in the future I will do political stuff on this podcast as well. And of course, I always interview people. I've been trying to get some more interviews with smaller and some bigger people. And maybe I will, in the future, I will be more frequent with the interviews. But I really wanted Content Minded to be mostly about, culture, art, especially philosophy. And then when I interview people for different things, of course, politics is always hovering in the background. Even in this episode today, I wanted to go into the various dimensions, sort of like even the hidden political dimensions of the works of truly one of my favorite artists, an artist that has influenced me immensely, Paul Cezanne. And a lot of the different issues around his artwork, both critical and foundational to what we understand as modern art. And I think I wanted to sort of put things into my own unique perspective on this episode. And because I've been reading a lot of different critical pieces, or by critical I mean by different art critics, on Paul Cezanne. One guy is contemporary and he's kind of like a lib, but I'll read that first. And then of course there was this amazing essay, because I own the collected essays and letters of Clement Greenberg. And I know a lot of people around these parts don't like Clement Greenberg. And there's a lot of warranted criticisms of the direction by which his immense influence took the art world in the later half of the 20th century that are still being parsed out here in the 21st century. And I wanted to do, maybe in the future, I'll do an episode on Nobody TM. I'll do an episode maybe on Mark Tobey. Mark Tobey's, for many years, has been another immense artistic influence on me since I discovered him when I think I was in high school when I discovered him. So if you want to support me, of course, go to patreon.com/giantproductions or substack.com/Gio's Content Corner. They're both $5 a month. Of course, the other tiers on Patreon will get you other things. I have to mail out some more prints to people. And of course, sign up. If you're going to Patreon, sign up on the desktop website, because Apple has made it in typical predatory Apple fashion. If you use the iOS app, then they want to take like a 30% cut. But if you're uncomfortable with that, then of course Substack. I always wanted to grow my Substack. I want to get back to even writing, but of course I have to get back to editing the book. Matthew, he's actually said he's edited huge portions of the book. So hopefully by the autumn, I can get back working on it. And I know some people, they do like my solo content because it's more focused. And it's not like you're paying attention to the chat or with your other people bring their own energy. So this won't be like, because I'm covering a topic I'm passionate about, but of course I'm reading a lot of material. Maybe I won't have so much of a power voice, but hopefully you find this quite enjoyable. And I think Cezanne is perhaps one of the most important artists who have ever lived. And in terms of the moment that we live in, he is one of the most important artists. If you want to talk about, let's say, second wave modernism, or what we understand as modern art, Cezanne is of immense importance for obvious reasons. And a lot of the reasons we'll get into. And the reasons that Clement Greenberg found him more favorable than a lot of impressionists. Because you have to remember, so yes, subscribe, like, share. I want to get back to doing shorts when I have time, because shorts, the YouTube algorithm quite likes. And of course, if you're uncomfortable with Patreon, I understand. I've contemplated, maybe if you can put in the comments your thoughts on this, I've contemplated also opening up a subscribe star for people that just don't like Patreon. But of course, if you don't like Patreon, then the Substack is $5 a month. I'm not like Night Owls. I don't charge you $8 a month for a Twitter space. I shouldn't bash them. I'm not. Listen, Nightmare Vision and Future Moldovan, they're both friends of mine, and I don't want to bash them. But it is something when you have to deal with. You have to be aware of the competition. But I mean, it's not really competition, because I like to think that I'm doing something different here. But let me begin. And next week I'll probably either release an interview or another Cole report. I'm aiming for another Cole report, because there's a lot of stuff around the nature, especially with this interview that Daryl Cooper, Martyr Maid, did with Tucker, that goes into the psychology of conservatives that I've talked about on the timeline on Twitter, or I should say X, /Giant Gio. And also the psychology of the pro-life movement. There's this one incident that happened recently that I'll probably talk about on the Cole report. But anyways, this show is not about that. Let me just say that there was this one interview that Picasso did when he was asked about the Impressionists. I believe Kathrine Greenberg also wrote about this. He said that, I never had any regard for the Impressionists. I never liked them, except for Cezanne. Cezanne was doing something interesting. And if you can, even just by a nominal aesthetic look into the works of people like Yves Tanguy, Georges Braque, and of course Picasso, you can see one easily translates into the other. Because there's sort of like this history of Impressionism, where in the European modern to contemporary art movements, the Impressionists, and I would say even painting as the capstone for a long time, was ignored, with Dadaism and so forth. Now, you would say that in the 80s in Italy, you had the trans avant-garde that tried to resurrect painting. This is what Paul Rhodes, Paul talks about. But you can easily see that Cezanne's style of direct viewing, of his utilization of shapes, that is a huge cornerstone of the influences on the styles of Cubism and then later modernist abstractions of the figure in particular that you find in people like Picasso. And you have to realize that even though the Impressionists for a long time were devalued in Europe, it was the American art movement, first with Urshel Gorky and then later with the New York School. But even before the New York School, you had the Northwest Visionary School that were based around places like Seattle and other places that were remote in that environment. I think even some of them had a correspondence with people in Vancouver like Emily Carr. Emily Carr is another big influence on me. But this is where Mark Tobey comes from. And they come a decade before, directly during the war and then in the post-war period, before the New York School. People like Jackson Pollock and his wife, Lee Krasner, Franz Klein, of course, Rothko. But in terms of action painting, people like Joan Mitchell and Pollock and so forth, that they had this reverence for the Impressionists, that they sort of resurrected their influences, even here in Canada with the Group of Seven. So it was North America that was more attuned to that style of depiction. And another issue is that Cezanne, he grates with the Impressionists as a post-impressionist because he didn't really hone their, let's say, scientific exploration of how light and color interact with each other. Because the Impressionists, you have to realize that they were kind of like the Hudson River School in America, they were really keenly aware to experiment on even a scientific basis on how light changes, perception changes light and shadow, and there was a sort of meticulous nature to what the composition of human perception is. But Cezanne, in a way that we will explore with these articles, one of the article that I think I'll put behind the paywall because it's very long and very interesting by Non-Site, which is very good. I mean, a lot of them are like Marxists or whatever, but Non-Site generally does have, nonsite.org does have a genuinely very fascinating, interesting collection of essays that are free. Nonsite.org. That goes into it, and it's a recent article, but it's not recent, it's from an art critic that has since passed, but the posting of it's recent. That goes into a critical lens on Cezanne. But I want to get into like why this episode is called Cezanne, Reactionary Modernism. Because he approached the landscape and all objects in a very phenomenological way. And this is what Merleau-Ponty in his famous essay, Cezanne's Doubt, goes into. What is Cezanne's doubt? His doubt over the depiction of the real as such, in a way that isn't using principles to allude to three-dimensionality like the Renaissance, nor is it using scientific principles to study light and shadow like the Impressionists. He's going at it, he's going to the subject matter bare in these essays that we'll explore. And there's even a hidden politics behind Cezanne that is very, in some ways, I would say, and this is what one art critic, who's at some university, whatever, says that, oh, it's in stark contrast to his artwork. But I don't believe that. I think that there's something there. That there is a form of going back to, I wouldn't say like traditionalism the way that we think of it as. Like, what is traditional painting? Academic realism. Bouguereau. No, this is not that. This is traditional in the way that Cezanne is tapping into something more primordial in our perception. And of course, Cezanne led a very traditional life, as we'll get into. And he had some based opinions, by the way. So, and this art critic is fuming over it, that I'm going to read to you to begin, because I know a lot of the meaningful stuff I paywall, but I got to give, new listeners red meat. But before I get into all of this, I want to say that recently, in the summer, I went to the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh with my significant other, and I was going through, and I had been there before, and not to location docs, but I've been there before, and I was fascinated because there was, the one time I went was a Japanese print exhibition that had a lot of woodcuts and also had some contemporary stuff, had some photogravure and intaglio prints and so forth, not just strictly the ukiyo woodcuts. But then this time they had the special exhibition on Bida Kuhn, and I quite like her pottery work, and it was really good. But the museum has a number of very fascinating modern art pieces, and stuff that even comes from the 70s and the 60s and so forth. But they have a number of Impressionists, and they have a very amazing Van Gogh landscape, one of my favorites. But they had one of my absolute favorite middle period Cezanne landscapes. And I remember going down the hall and I saw it. It was landscape near Ugh, or Ochs, the plain of the Arc River, 1893. And it's 4 trees. Very similarly, the trees are kind of similar to the trees in the Bathers. And this is when Cezanne was really transforming his style. When you can see the pixelization of reality. You can see him wrestling with the shapes. And the way that the trees are swaying. I remember just looking at him like, I can't believe it. I never thought in my life that I would ever, because, being like a hermit most of my life, right? I never thought that I would ever get to experience this type of art in person before. because I always wanted to go to the McMichael Gallery. I think I went to the McMichael Gallery when I was a very small kid. And I've always wanted to go back because the McMichael Gallery is one of the homes of the Group of Seven. And yeah, they have these special exhibitions that I'm not very interested in. It's like, maybe some of them, maybe even just for like a laugh. They have this like women of color one. But yeah, maybe some of it looks kind of interesting. I shouldn't bash it right away. But if I were to go to the McMichael Gallery, it would be obviously to go see the Group of Seven paintings. So this one in particular is a very interesting piece by Cezanne because you can see him trying to keep with the aerial perspective or the principles of aerial perspective that you find in the impressionists that came before him. But what's interesting is that he's sort of losing grip of those principles. That he's seeing the shapes and he's navigating the colors and the shapes as they are for themselves. That there is an immediate perspectival nature to it. That his interpretation is a sensuous engagement with it. That he doesn't really care that the house is just a house in the corner. It doesn't matter. That's irrelevant if it's a house. He's not trying to paint a house amongst the trees on the hilltop. Sorry, amidst the trees. Even the trees themselves, they're not full to the extent that you would think as an illusion of what a tree is. He's simply engaging. He's starting to realize that he's engaging with the subject matter on its own terms. The way that perception hits the eye immediately. And a lot of these people that are into plein air, and I love plein air, people like Jim McVickers and so forth, people like, I shouldn't even mention them, but I will mention them. But you have guys like, for example, that are very popular in watercolor, guys like Joseph Spudvik, or especially Alvaro Castañer. And I admit, I watched all those videos back in the day on early YouTube of Alvaro Castañer, the painter with passion. But you have to realize what they're doing is that when they are doing plein air, it's not that they're chasing they kind of are. They're still chasing the light. They're still chasing the scene. But the scene of nature is just a staging ground for them. Because if you have like a lot of these artists that are trying to make a living or they have these corporate brands, then what they're doing is they're not caring so much about the composition that's immediately in front of them. They're caring about an appealing composition in general, based on the metric of what their brand is. And so that's why a lot of these painters, they keep coming out with the same stuff. The same rainy day landscape, cityscape, you name it. So, same with even landscape painters that do plein air being like they go directly into nature, they paint the scene alla prima, all at once, and they're trying to chase the light, they're trying to chase the composition. A lot of them, they do fix their work, they do switch things around, they do try to make things as appealing as possible. And there's a lot of things you can find that are mundane, that can be very interesting given the darks and the lights. But at the end of the day, they're really not trying to do what Cezanne was doing in the landscape. Because they're fixing things, and then you fall into a habit of where you're like, well, I'm trying to chase this, but really they're caring more about the composition in general. To where they're kind of like, there's a moment, and I've been there, there's a moment where you're painting outdoors where you remember the way the light kind of looked, you sort of start ignoring what you're looking at, and you're falling back on the principles of composition, the principles of painting, and you're falling back on, can I fudge things enough to make a very interesting composition? But Cezanne did not care about that. He didn't care that, it looked flat. Because that was the point. He cared about what was directly in front of him. And this comes from what Merleau-Ponty talked about in Cezanne's Doubt. Which maybe I will uncover, but it's been a few years since I've actually read the essay. But I feel like a lot of the stuff that Clement Greenberg and this essay from Non-Sight talks about is the foundation of what you would find in the essay Cezanne's Doubt. Now, I do encourage people, it's a short essay, but I do encourage people to read Cezanne's Doubt. It's a very good essay. And it's a very good essay because it's a philosopher engaging in art criticism rather than an art critic trying to engage in philosophy. Very, very different thing there. And after a while, you can tell. If you've read enough art critics, you know that an art critic engaging in philosophy sometimes doesn't work. In fact, it oftentimes doesn't work. But a philosopher engaging in art criticism, well, that's probably the best you're going to get. So, but you know, Clement Greenberg, he did have a philosophic flair, I will say. So let's get into this essay on the politics and the personality of Cezanne. Then I'll get to the Greenberg essay. Then I'll get to the non-site essay, which is very important, which takes a critical lens on what this one particular writer thinks is a very, like, almost like a stark or like a darker nature to Cezanne in terms of his painting. So let's get into it. So before we get into the political article, here is some quotes, actually, from the essay Cezanne's Doubt. And it's by some other artist. Looked in the essay from my art theory, was struck at how the idea about Cezanne's painting process struck a chord in my own painting, blah, blah, blah. Quote, Cezanne was abandoning himself to chaos of sensation. For example, the illusion we have when we move our heads that objects themselves are moving, if our own judgment did not consistently set these appearances straight. Cezanne was always seeking to avoid the ready-made alternative suggested to him, sensation versus judgment. Now, sensation versus judgment is, again, the core of what Cezanne's phenomenological approach that Merleau-Ponty found such intellectual weight in. And the one author from the non-site essay goes into the Kantianism or post-Kantianism of Cezanne, which we will cover. But sensation versus judgment. Judgment is obviously the faculties by which we determine what a preconceived notion, an a posteriori notion of what an object is in the world, what a tree is. A tree has a certain weight of a shadow, a certain grounding to its relationship to the earth. A tree has foliage that, by definition, in terms of a work of art, must be abstracted. You can't literally paint every single leaf on a tree. But Cezanne was just taking in that pre-faculty of judgment, the a priori information that comes into one's purview, into what Kant would call the faculties of the understanding, the pre-faculty sensations, that raw data, if you will, to use a sort of like, you know, modern colloquial metaphor, that raw data that comes into sensation. Cezanne says, what is it like to just paint that sensation? To leave the preconceived notions of not the object I'm looking at. I'm looking at a mountain, a tree. But rather, I am looking at a series of images that are informed by shapes, colors, relationships to color, and what those shapes themselves are. And so Cezanne was sort of collapsing his entire view of the artistic tradition that had led to that point. Because now he's just going to the things themselves. That is the ultimate expression of phenomenology, going back to the things themselves. So then there's another quote from Cezanne's Doubt. Cezanne did not think he had to choose between feeling and thought, or a sensation and understanding or judgment, as if you were deciding between chaos and order. He did not want to separate the stable things which we see and the shifting ways in which they appear. He wanted to depict matter as it takes on form, the birth of order through spontaneous organization. Cezanne wanted to paint this primordial world, and his pictures therefore seem to show nature pure, while photographs of the same landscape suggest man's works, conveniences, and imminent presence. He wanted to put intelligent ideas, science, perspective, and tradition back in touch with the world of nature, which they were intended to comprehend. By remaining faithful to the phenomenon, he is an investigation of perspectives. Cezanne discovered what recent psychologists have come to formulate: the lived perspective. Again, this is Merleau-Ponty. This is existential phenomenology. That which we actually perceive is not a geometric or photographic one. When the overall composition of the picture is seen globally, perspectival distortions are no longer visible in their own right, but rather contribute, as they do in natural vision, to impression of an emerging order, an object in the act of appearing, organizing itself before our eyes. He would start by discovering the geological foundations of the landscape. Then the task before him was first to forget all he had ever learned from science, and second, through science to recapture the structure of the landscape as an emerging organism. He was not God and wanted nevertheless to portray the world, to change it completely into a spectacle, to make visible how the world touches us. So he's not trying to create what the Impressionists before him tried to do, especially Monet. Remember what they called, what they talked about when they talked about Monet's paintings at Giverny, at his residence. They called it a harem of nature, because he depicted the beauteousness of nature in such a way as to stage it, as to put his perfect plants that he wanted, his perfect garden, a garden similar to the ones at Armot, what was that one? They made an Assassin's Creed character of him, but he was an actual real historical figure. The sort of a Muslim mystic who was also part of a great band of assassins, El Sabah. That they had this mystical garden where they'd give you substances and you'd see beautiful maidens from heaven, and you would be initiated into the order of the assassins. And it was almost like that. It was almost like a perfect Edenic garden. But what Cezanne is saying is that, no, you have to reject this. Because the Impressionists, they, like the Hudson River people that were communicating with geologists and with color theory, and even before them, way before them, you had Goethe with his theory of color. You had a lot of science. They were painters, but in a lot of ways, they were almost like doing scientific experiments on light and shadow. And that's how they came up with their own unique take on aerial perspective. That, for example, shadows had color. Shadows had complementary colors. They weren't like the sort of gray and brown and darker hues of, for example, the Baroque. And so they were trying to create scientific principles of perception. But Cezanne comes along and has what shouldn't seem like a novel idea. He says, no, why don't you abandon that? Why don't you go back to the things themselves? So in other words, he wasn't doing what usual artists like to do, especially landscape painters, where you are staging nature into a form. You are using natural elements to highlight a narrative. You are using it as the creation of God to rearrange the landscape in your image, right? And all great artists do this. But Cezanne broke, even though Cezanne, in a lot of ways, in my opinion, reaffirmed a very sort of, in the pure sense of the word, a reactionary tradition to the work of art. He broke from it by going something even more primordial than that, which is those first few glimpses of perception, of what is it like to capture trees in the wind, or a cat walking by the street. Your first immediate perception is just a moving blob of color, of shapes, of the sort of trail of movement. But how do you really depict that in such a solid form, in a solidified work of art, in a plastic art, like painting? And so Cezanne was at pains, and this is where Cezanne's doubt comes from, is that he arranged everything in such a way as that everything communicates with each other on the canvas. There's a splash of sienna here, there's a splash of sienna there, and he was very cautious. He took sometimes hours where he would be looking at something. He would be looking at an arrangement of shapes, and he would try to depict, like, what would this one singular brushstroke be in terms of a true depiction of what that thing he was doing, whether it was a still life or a landscape. And so I think he was going back to something originary. He was going back to nature itself. And no matter what he was depicting, whether it was even a figure. That's why his figure often looks flat. Because he's just depicting what he's seeing in that moment. But he's doing it in such a careful way. So this is from Cezanne's Doubt. He quickly parted ways with the Impressionists. However, Impressionism was trying to capture in the painting the very way in which objects stride our eyes and attack our senses. Objects were depicted as they appear to instantaneous perception, without fixed contours bound together by light and air. To capture this envelope of light, one had to exclude siennas, ochres, and black, and use only 7 colors of the spectrum. And again, they learned that again from scientific principles. The color of objects could not be represented simply by putting on the canvas their local tone, that is, the color they take on in isolation. Rather, the color of objects cannot be represented simply the color they take on isolating from their surroundings. One also had to pay attention to the phenomena of contrast with modified local colors in nature. Furthermore, by a sort of reversal of every color we perceive in nature elicits the appearance of its complement. So, for example, blue, you have blue and violet contrasted with reds and greens and so forth. Or rather, violet and yellow would be the complement of each other. That's why there's a lot of like purple, mauvish, and blue shadows in winter scenes. Finally, the Impressionists break down the local tone itself. One can generally obtain any color by juxtaposing rather than mixing the color which made it up. So this is color matching. This isn't mixing the color. It's putting swatches of color together to create this color field, or what we call broken color. The result of this procedures was that the canvas, which no longer corresponded point by point to nature, afforded a general true impression through the action of separate parts onto another. But at the same time depicting the atmosphere and breaking up tones submerged the object and caused it to lose its proper weight. The composition of Cezanne's palette leads one to support that he had another aim. Instead of the 7 colors of the spectrum, one from 8 colors, 6 red, 5 yellow, 3 blues, 3 greens, and black. So all the complementary. I use a split palette as well. I mean, most landscape painters do. The use of warm colors and black shows that Cezanne wanted to represent the object, to find it again behind the atmosphere. So the object itself, rather than the principles to create a convincing object to the human eye, or what your mental bias of what a convincing object is. Rather, Cezanne is saying you need black, because if you see black, it's there. Likewise, he does not break up his tone. Rather, he replaces this technique with gradual colors, a progression of chromatic nuances across the object, a modulation of colors which stays close to the object's form and the light it receives. So he was only focused on the appearance of color. And if there was a shift in tone of light and dark, then c'est la vie, it happened. But he wasn't concerned with that. That's why the later Cezanne almost appears like abstract expressionism. It almost appears as if it is abstracted. It appears as if there is no differentiation in the atmospheric perspective of objects that are receded, objects that are furthest away being bluer of the atmosphere, having less details. Cezanne just painted it the way he saw it, really. Lost in relationship with the atmosphere and other objects, it seems subtly illuminated from within. Light emanates from it. The result is an impression of solidity and material substance. Moreover, Cezanne does not give up making the warm colors vibrant, but achieves the chromatic sensation through the use of blue. One must therefore say Cezanne wished to return to the object without abandoning the impressionist aesthetics, which takes nature as its model. Emile Bernard reminds him that for the classic artists, painting demanded outline, composition, distribution of light. Cezanne replied, they create pictures, we are attempting a piece of nature. And that's the difference. He said of the old masters that they replaced reality with imagination and by the abstraction which accompanies it. Of nature, he said, the artist must conform to this perfect work of art. Everything comes to us from nature. We exist through it. Nothing else is worth remembering. He stated that we wanted to make Impressionism something solid like the art of the museums. His painting was paradoxical. He was pursuing reality without giving up the sensuous surface. with no other guide than the immediate impression of nature, without following the contours, with no outline to enclose the color, with no perspectival or pictorial arrangement. This is what Bernard called Cezanne unaliving, aiming for reality while denying himself the means to attain it. This is the reason for his difficulties and for the distortions one finds in his pictures between 1870 and 1890. Cups and saucers and tables seen from the side should be elliptical, but Cezanne's paints the two ends of the ellipsis swollen and expanded. The work table in his portrait of Gustave Geoffroy stretches, contrary to the law of perspective, into the lower part of the picture. In giving up the outline, Cezanne was abandoning himself to chaos of sensation, which upsets the objects and constantly suggests illusions. For example, the illusion we have when we move one head of the object themselves are moving, if our judgment did not constantly set these appearances straight. According to Bernard, Cezanne submerged his paintings in ignorance and his mind in shadows. But one cannot really judge his paintings in the way except by closing one's mind to half of what he said and one's eyes to what he painted. But let's go back to that statement. Let's examine what he said here. They created pictures. We are attempting a piece of nature. He said of the old masters, they replace reality with imagination by abstraction which accompanies it. So they imagine nature as a category, as a categorical phenomenon by which you slot nature into its phenomenon rather than seeing it itself. Or rather, seeing the objects of nature themselves for what they are. And so there's a lot of illusion, there's a lot of perspectival rules, there's a lot of rules of design and composition that go into the classic Renaissance painting. But what Cezanne is doing is he's blowing up those relationships. And he's saying, why don't you just actually paint as it comes to you in its immediacy? And so here we have him basking in perception. In other words, there's no sort of illusion to the principles of painting that are still there in Cezanne, but it's more of his, it's as if those principles are happenstance. Whereas what he's trying to do is he's trying to get what the object looks like in that moment. And that's where Cezanne's doubt comes from. The ability to capture things as they are themselves. Whereas the staging and the principles of perspective, of focal points, of tone, of color hue, of light and shadow, that comes with traditional painting, that is in a way a staging of nature. We know that it's not the way that we might look at something, but it's there because it creates a composition that's harmonious, because it suggests forms. Like aerial perspective, you may look at things only like really far out do you see things bluer and cooler and less detailed, but vision can look at things as a totality. Whereas a painter, an artist, has to separate things naturally, has to distinguish between things, has to use certain principles of composition. Now, Cezanne, for example, he even often would violate the rule of thirds, meaning like it's more harmonious if you had the third of the picture space, the borders, where your focal point doesn't drag towards the middle of the piece. That's violating like the weird golden rule, the sort of the golden rule, where if your focal point is directly in the middle, there's something that appears kind of off when it comes to a natural and a harmonious composition. If a focal point is somewhere along one of the thirds of the canvas of the painting or drawing, then the composition tends to come out more natural. Whereas if it's dead square in the middle, then you have this like weirdness to it. But Cezanne, he didn't care. Like some of the trees that constituted his main focal points or the main composition of the piece, in that case, the vertical of the piece, which is represented by the trees, sometimes he did put them in the middle. And he really wasn't beholden to a lot of the rules of perspective. And so this leads us to it will lead us to the essay by Clement Greenberg, but let's read a little bit more from Cezanne's doubt. And so here, Merleau-Ponty is saying exactly what I said, where he says, the line remaining faithful to the phenomenon in his investigations of perspective. Cezanne discovered what recent psychologists have come to formulate the lived perspective. The objects we see close at hand appear smaller, thus far away seem larger, as they do in photographs. To say the circle seems obliquely is seen as an ellipsis is the substitute for actual perception, what we would see if we were cameras. In reality, we see a form which oscillates around the ellipsis without being an ellipsis. In a portrait of Madame Cezanne, which was his wife, that he was kind of like a trad cell. He married her, but then he like grew out of love with her, but then he like stayed around with her, even though he's like, oh no, you're kind of not my thing anymore. But then I guess they had Cezanne, they had Paul Cezanne Jr., Paul Jr., and so Cezanne, he said like he didn't love his wife, but then he continued to paint her right up until the day he died. So, you know, I guess love comes out in many different forms. The border of the wall, that's just a side note. The border of the wall on one side of her body does not form a straight line with that of the other. And indeed it is known that if the line passes beneath a wide strip of paper, the two visible segments appear dislocated. So the wallpaper behind her. Gustave Joffre's table stretches into the bottom of the picture, and indeed with our eye runs over a large surface. The image as successfully receives are taken from different points of view, and the whole surface is warped. It is true that I freeze these distortions in repainting them on the canvas. I stop the spontaneous movement in which they pile up in perception and tend towards the geometric perspective. This is also what happens with color. Pink upon gray paper colors in the background green. Academic painting shows the background is gray, assuming that the picture will produce the same effect of contrast as the real object. Impressionist painting uses green in the background in order to achieve a contrast as brilliant as that of the object's nature. And so, the green in the background, even I believe John Singer Sargent did this with a number of floral still lifes, but also in portraiture. And people do this to this day. A lot of like modern portrait people, they'll still use green because, especially like a very deep viridian that has a lot of blue in it, will contrast with the very warm colors, the very violet and warm and cadmiums and the sort of warmish shadows you find in portraiture. And even in the skin tone, in the Renaissance, they even discovered this, where they would use a bit of viridian green, or they would mix a green a little bit in certain spots of the shadows to highlight portraits or to highlight figure pieces. So around the arms, for instance, because there still is a subtle greenishness to very pale and very red skin. And so that's the basic science of color complementary colors. And so a green background will work very well to pop out that portrait, to make it vibe, to make it have a verve. But Cezanne, he does do this, but then he sort of breaks those rules. So here he says, green is the background in order to achieve the contrast of the impressions between green as the background as that of the objects in nature. Doesn't this falsify the color relationship? It would if it stopped there, but the painter's task is to modify all other colors in the picture so that they take away from the green background its characteristics of a real color. Exactly, it's not a real color. It's just a staging. It's the sort of grisaille. It's the pre-painting, right? Similarly, it's Cezanne's genius that when the overall composition of the picture is seen globally, perspectival distortions are no longer visible in their own right, but rather contribute, as they do in the natural vision, to impression of an emerging order. An object in the act of appearing, organizing itself beyond our eyes. In the same way, the contour of an object conceived as a line encircling the object belongs not to the visible, but to geometry. If one outlines the shape of an apple with a contour continuous line, one makes an object of the shape, whereas the contour is rather ideal limit towards which the sides of the apple recede in depth. Not to indicate any shape would be deprived of the object of their identity. To trace just a single outline sacrifices depth. That is the dimension in which the thing is presented not as a spread out before us, not as spread out before us, but as an inexcusable reality full of reserves. This is why Cezanne follows the swell of the object in modulated colors and indicates several outlines in blue. Rebounding among them, one's glance captures a shape that emerges from another among them all, just as it does in perception. So there's the essay in Non-Sight, which I will put behind the paywall, because I have to go into depth about that, and it's a very good essay. And there's a lot of theory selling about the nature of painting and art. What this does is it makes sense from a phenomenological point of view. Now, I wasn't going to read Cezanne. I was going to read Clement Greenberg, this non-sight essay, and this critical essay by Saul Nelson, who's a contemporary art professor, art history professor. And he's like a kind of a lib. And there was this other great book I found on the philosophy of Henri Bergson and vitalism, and the duration, the works of Bergson, who was immensely influential on thinkers like Deleuze, and the works of a lot of the English painters, like the Vorticists, like Wyndham Lewis, like John Duncan Ferguson, but also a lot of them were inspired by Cezanne, and Cezanne has this very good relationship in terms of conceptually to Henri Bergson and the notion of vitalism, the duration, and so forth. So, but here, this is very important. It's very important to follow along here. And this really is the linchpin for the other essays that I'm going to review as well. Cezanne, similar to the Chinese literati painters who used sumi ink, who were combining painting, especially the landscape, with text, with calligraphy. It was a multifaceted artwork. But similar to the literati painters, where you have the suggestion of form that is inexhaustible, where mountains recede into the lakes, into the fog, and there's always a presencing. There's not full presence, there's a presencing, as Heidegger would say. And I was very, very fortunate before my philosophy department crapped the bed. When I was in university, I was very fortunate, even though I couldn't understand them half the time, because it was a very thick Chinese accent. I was very fortunate to have a professor who was doing the philosophy of Chinese painting, but who was also a Heideggerian, and who was very learned in Taoism and Martin Heidegger. So that sort of like informed my journey, and maybe one day I will release my master's thesis. But I have to like retool it or whatever. Anyways, the point being is that, but this is pertinent because that was a large part of my master's thesis. It was actually on Chinese art, Chinese literati painting, and the works of Deleuze and Guattari on the nature of identity. But here Cezanne is painting things that are a series of outlines that emerge from the picture plane, that emerge from its surroundings. And he learned this, of course, from a lot of techniques, even dating to the Renaissance, but usually around the later Renaissance and then the Baroque, and especially like the Rococo and so forth. Like Rubens was very good at this when he was doing a lot of still lifes. Is that Cezanne learned the principle of when there is an amalgamation of objects, say for example a bunch of fruit on a table, that light will bounce off that object. So to mimic that, the sort of casting light that is shaping the object. Now, a lot of still lifes with, for example, cutlery, especially silver cutlery, or knights' helmets or whatever, is very good at this, because how do you paint something that is as reflective as steel? You paint what is around that steel. In other words, say a pear or an orange apple is creating a light source because the orange is bouncing off that apple and hitting the other objects. So Cezanne, he's not concerned with painting the ideal of an orange with light and shadow. He's rather painting the relations of those objects to each other. And same with the landscape. This is why you'll have patches of color everywhere. Not just like the Impressionists. The Impressionists were very selective and very scientific about how they approached broken color or color matching. Instead of blending, they would put swabs of color next to each other. Look at any sky by Monet, or even who else am I thinking of? Even Renoir to an extent. You'll see that the way they blend color is by slowly introducing color swatches, color brushstrokes to that fade. Say an azure sky, where you have very light at the bottom, very light hues of orange, but you have darker hues of crimson at the top. You slowly start to introduce that crimson to the bottom. You color match. You put color next to each other. You don't necessarily blend as much. There's a lot of visible brushstrokes. But they're doing it in a way that's very scientific. So the complementary colors, the way that certain times of day would cast certain shadows, and sometimes it's more warm shadows as opposed to lighter shadows. The time of year, because remember, winter landscapes are notoriously hard to paint on plein air because you have to really invent a lot of warm shadows. And sometimes you'll get that very brilliant light with a very, very cool and dark shadow, but the very warm snow. And it's a matter of inventing those things. But Cezanne is saying, I don't care about that. I'm just going to reflect what's around the object. And then from that, the object will emerge in the work of art. From those pale, watered down, very minute strokes. Because remember, in literati painting, you can't modify, I mean, people do, but you can't modify brushstrokes, at least on a spiritual level. When it's just one shot, one go, that's it. Move on to the next stroke. So the object, if you've ever looked at a Chinese landscape, really intensely look at it. The suggestion of form comes from the nothingness. It unconceals itself. It reveals itself through the act of unconcealment. And then you see suggestions of other mountains in the nether regions of the painting. And it goes on. And there's a crane at the bottom, a bird, a boatman. The point being is that there's not a revealing by using principles. The principles there's principles there. But it's more about the object appearing to us from suggestions of what is around it, from the nothingness by which the object is surrounded by. If you've ever looked at a Chinese landscape, especially the mountains. My favorite one that I put in my master's thesis by Sashu Toro, the famous, and it only took a few brushstrokes, but he represented Mount Longhu. I think it was Mount Longhu, or it may have been another famous mountain in China that the Taoists would pray on in China. I gotta stop doing the Trump thing, but the point being is that he's using, Cezanne, the same principles. That the contour around the object makes the object appear. That there is this weaving-like relationship between things. Because that's the perception of things. You go into a room and you take the objects as a whole. That's the immediate perception. Do this right now. Go into a room. And a room that you've never been before. And you take every object, the chairs, the lamps, the desks, everything at once. And then you differentiate the people in the room, why you're in the room, it's a doctor's office, whatever. But the point being is that discrimination is a second order a posteriori effect of rationality, of the categories of the understanding, as Kant would say. The immediate perception, the immediate sensation, is to take things as a whole. And the only way, the character, the energy, the essence of that room, the vital, élan vital, that's what Bergson would say. The élan vital, the vibe the energy of that room is a whole. And then you discriminate. Then you say, well, I'm going to sit in that chair because I like that chair in the corner of the room. And then it's closest to the door because I don't have to walk a lot. I know I'm lazy. I know I'm telling myself, but you know what I mean. So the point being is that the discrimination comes later. So when Cezanne paints fruit, he's not really painting fruit. He's painting a whole geometry of objects and relations between things. And very similar to existential phenomenology. Your embeddedness, your thrownness, your relationship to things around you, that is what constitutes what those things are. And so this is why Merleau-Ponty was so fascinated by Cezanne. Because he's looking at the immediacy and this doubt, the anxiety he had to express that immediacy without any discrimination. Because what's very funny, though, is a lot of people point to Cezanne's personal life, how conservative, trad calf he was, and how he was like a political reactionary, which we'll get into. That, how could this guy create such revolutionary art form? He was basically the foundation of all modern, well, I mean, to what we understand is modernist art, especially modern painting. From Cubism to Fauvism to Dada even. It was Cezanne. So here's another quote by Merleau-Ponty. The tablecloth lighted layer of fresh fallen snow upon which the place settings rose systematically, crowned with blonde rolls. All throughout my youth, said Cezanne, I wanted to paint that the tablecloth of a fresh fallen snow. Now I know that one must only want to paint rows. Symmetry, the place system, symmetrically, the place settings blonde rolls. If I paint crowned, I'm done for, you understand. But if I really balance and shade my place settings and rolls as they are in nature, you can be sure the crowns, the snow, and the whole shebang will be there. So he's really not trying to paint the discriminatory object. He's just painting perceptions of those things. The table is like a snow pile. The rolls of bread are like blonde tufts. Countering with distinctions of soul and body, thought and vision is no use here. For Cezanne returns to just the primordial experience from which these notions are derived and which they are inescapable or inseparable. The painter who conceptualizes and seeks the expression first misses the mystery, renewed every time we look at something. No discrimination between body and soul, between perception, thought, and feeling. Cezanne wants to go to the things themselves. He wants to go back to the originary source of all things. That is the revolutionary spirit of Cezanne. But it is one that is deeply reactionary. Because there is no separation in the spiritual realm, according to a lot of, mystery school people, mesmeritists, the second spiritualists. A lot of those mystery schools, they will say the same thing. The one, the all, the numinous, the Ein Sof, all of those things are one. There's no discrimination, no separation. The Ouroboros form. You're fans of, 90s death metal, you'll know that reference. That's a cynic reference. But you know what I mean? So the point being is that Cezanne wants to go back to something deeper than anything. Deeper than the depictions of the spiritual you'll find, for example, in Raphael. Because Raphael was coming at it from a very well thought out theological and art tradition understanding of the spiritual that has especially informed Catholicism for millennia. But Cezanne, being like a trad cath himself, he never really painted a lot of religious art. I mean, he certainly wasn't like Chagall, who painted a lot of biblical scenery. Or Gauguin, who wanted to find this primitivist spirituality. Cezanne realized that the spiritual is in that first order a priori perception, is the basis of all things on this earth, is the immediacy, the thrownness into everything. So here, Merleau-Ponty says, we live in the midst of man-made objects among tools and houses, streets, cities, and most of the time we see them only through the human action which put them to use. We become used to thinking that all this exists necessarily unshakably. Cezanne's paintings suspend these habits of thought and reveal the basis of inhuman nature upon which man has installed himself. This is why Cezanne's people are strange, as if viewed by a creature of another species. Nature itself is stripped of the attributes which make it ready for animalistic consumption and communions. There is no wind in the landscape, no movement on le Dianse. The frozen objects hesitate at the beginning of the world. It is an unfamiliar world in which one is uncomfortable, and which forbids all human elusiveness. If one looks at the work of other painters after seeing Cezanne's paintings, one feels somehow relaxed, just as conversations resumed after a period of mourning mask the absolute change and resort to the survival of their solidity. But indeed, only a human being is capable of such a vision, which penetrates right to the root of things beneath the imposed order of humanity. All indications are that animals cannot look at things, cannot penetrate them in expectation of nothing but the truth. Emile Bernard's statement that a realistic painter is only an ape is therefore precisely the opposite of the truth. And one sees how Cezanne was able to revive the classical definition of art, man added to nature. Cezanne's paintings deny neither science nor tradition. He went to the Louvre every day when he was in Paris. He believed that one must learn how to paint, and that the geometric study of planes and forms is a necessary part of this learning process. He inquired about the geological structure of the landscapes, convinced that these abstract relationships expressed, however, in terms of the visible world, should affect the act of painting. The rules of anatomy and design are present in each stroke of his brush, just as the rules of the game underlie each stroke of a tennis match. Or, well, a hockey game. But what motivates the painter's movement can never be simply perspective or geometry or the laws governing the breakdown of color, or for that matter, any particular knowledge. Motivating all the movements from which a picture gradually emerges, there can be only one thing: the landscape in its totality, and the absolute fullness, precisely what Cezanne called a motif. He would start by discovering the geological foundations of the landscape, then according to Madame Cezanne, he would halt and look at everything with widened eyes, germinating with the countryside. The task before him was first to forget all he had ever learned from science, and second, through these sciences, to recapture the structure of the landscape as an emerging organism, the élan vital. See how that works? To do this, all the partial views one catches sight of must be welded together. All the eye's versatility dispenses must be renewed and reunited. One must, as Gasquet put it, join the wandering hands of nature. A minute of the world is going by which must be painted in its full reality. His meditation would suddenly be consumed. I have a hold on my motif. Cezanne would say, and he would explain, the landscape had to be tackled neither too high nor too low, caught alive in a net which would let nothing escape. Then he began to paint all parts of the painting at the same time, using patches of color to surround his original charcoal sketch of the geological skeleton. The picture took on a fullness and density. It grew in structure and balance. It came to maturity all at once. The landscape thinks itself in me, he would say, and I am its consciousness. Nothing could be farther from naturalism than this intuitive science. Art is not imitation, nor is something manufactured according to the wishes of instinct or good taste. It is a process of expression. Just as the function of words is a name, that is, to grasp the nature of what appears to us in a confused way and to place it before us a recognizable object, so it is up to the painter, said Gasquet, to objectify, project, and arrest. Words do not look like the things they designate, and picture is not a trompe l'oeil. It's not allusion to what it looks like to you as it's like a photocopied, hyperrealism, right? Cezanne, in his own words, quote, writes in painting what had never yet been painted, and turns into painting once and for all. We forgetting the viscous, equivocal appearances, go through them straight to the things they present. The painter recaptures and converts into visible objects what would, without him, remain walled up in a separate life of each consciousness, the vibration of appearances which is cradle of things. Only one emotion is possible for this painter, the feeling of strangeness, and only one lyricism, that of the continual rebirth of existence. Incredibly important. And let me break this down, and we'll take a little music break. Then we'll come back to the essay by Nelson about the politics and the lifestyle of Cezanne. So for the first part, I'll probably, because that's what the non-site essay deals with. I'll save it for the paywall, about the inhuman nature of Cezanne. How it is as if he's painting a perception of things without the discrimination of the human, without what we collectively agree upon as this bowl of fruit, this is how you do a painting, this is what a landscape should look like. There's an odd emptiness, not in terms of content, not in terms of thought even, it's full of thought, but there's an emptiness of human influence to the immediate perception of Cezanne. And if you are to read Cezanne's Doubt, this is probably the most important passage in Cezanne's Doubt. It's, he denies that sense of tradition, so he creates a skeleton by which he's using ordinary tools of perspective and so forth with the charcoal drawing. Oftentimes, when you're not painting with a grisaille underlayer of, for example, gray or siennas or whatever, charcoal drawings often suffice, especially when you're doing plein air. But he's not willing to... He's not doing a trompe l'oeil. He's not doing a sort of hyperrealism where it looks like it's a parlor trick. It's an illusion. It's something that looks like it could be a photograph. That it's this immediate recording of nature. It's this recording of a facsimile of nature. It's taking a still image of nature. But when you do, say you're hiking, and you see a landscape, and you see that the colors are changing because of the light. I remember this one line, I think it was from an Alvaro Castañer tutorial video. It was the one he did with that one video company. They stopped producing videos that did all the landscape painters. AFV, I think. Where he was in Spain. He was in Cadaqués. And he says, I know the light is changing very rapidly, but I remember what it looks like. My original idea was. So in other words, Alvaro Castañer is not painting directly what the light is. He's painting that original impression, but then using the principles of composition. He's remembering certain things, and he's fudging certain things and playing with them. Go to any plein air landscape YouTuber. There's many of them. There's this one guy in San Francisco. He's quite good. He'll say like, oh, well, I have to move the bridge around. I have to move this tree around just to make it a good composition. And of course, when you're constricted by time, when you're outside, when the light radically changes on you, depending on the time of day, you really only have like a window of like maybe an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours if you stretch it. If you have a good enough memory, if you have a good enough original sketch, you can hammer it out, right? But with Cezanne, and this is the basis, and this is why Clement Greenberg is so sympathetic to Cezanne as opposed to the other impressionists that came before Cezanne and after, is that you go for a hike, right? And there's shadows, little subtleties of changes, and there's little things that you spot that disappear, it seems, and you think you're looking at one tree, but then you're looking at another one. Then you walk along the trail a little bit more, and you see a different side of that landscape. Say you're looking down upon a lake. Like, say you're in Algonquin, right? And you're looking down on that lake, and there's a little different part of the hill that you're looking down from the escarpment. And so your perspective always changes. Your impression of that landscape always changes. Right? What Cezanne is doing is he's doing a radical shift in the perspectival nature of what a solid, flat medium of painting can do. A static medium. Because remember, painting is not the moving image. It's not movies. There were experimental artists that would use film with painting in mind, or would try to create visual paintings. Nam June Paik comes to mind. The one filmmaker, what's his name? It's on the tip of my tongue. Stan Brakhage. Yeah, Brakhage. Dog Star Man is like his famous one. But Stan Brockhage, he was basically doing like visual painting. He was doing something that was using manipulation of film, and he was basically doing sort of like abstract expressionism, but in the medium of film. So Stan Brockhage, he's like one of the best. I highly recommend him. A follower of mine actually recommended him. And he did all of these experimental films, and some of them are quite short because they're like these visual motifs of perception. And that's what Cezanne is trying to do. He's trying to take the medium of painting into this engagement with the natural world that is a collection of immediate sensations. Not one particular moment in time, the way that plein air landscape painter is trying to capture the light of one particular instance in time. Rather, the whole surrounding of his perceptions, of his impressions of that landscape come together in one picture plane, in one work of art that is static. So he doesn't really have to paint in a way that suggests wind or motion like the Impressionists are trying to do. He's not trying to paint those shadows themselves. Rather, he is trying to paint immediate perception, but the conglomeration of when you were walking around a certain landscape. And there's all these little shadows and all these little things that you're seeing off into the distance. You can't really take all of them together. And so that's Cezanne's doubt. It's the impossibility of that. Of always fidgeting, of always trying to find in one piece of art, a collection, a totality of perceptions. In a static medium. Unlike film, unlike nature films, where you can immediately capture different motifs of that one scene in the landscape. And so this very much influenced later art movements. I mean, Cubism imploded perception. And like Braque and Picasso, trying to do that task of how do you take a solid medium, a static image of a painting, and how do you make it record different angles of the same object? How do you make it record all different perspectives surrounding that object? Not the object. The object itself comes from that perception, that perspectival horizon. Again, if you know anything about phenomenology, I mean, this is Husserl, this is Heidegger, this is Merleau-Ponty. This is the life world of the horizon around that object in its totality. The way that Van Gogh painted in totality. The life world of, for example, the peasant's shoes that Heidegger was such a fan of. Because say I have my fez right here. How do I depict that fez in different angles? I'm twirling it right now. How do I depict it in one single work of art? Different positions, different angles, different perceptions. So the Cubists, modern art after Cezanne, took the lead. Because Cezanne is still basking in traditional painting. He's still painting the landscape. He's still painting still lifes. He's still painting portraits. But he's painting them as a totality of what is surrounding them. So that's what's very important to understand in Cezanne's doubt. This is why Cezanne is a phenomenological painter. Then he goes on to say Da Vinci's motto was persistent rigor in all the classical works in the art of poetry tell us that creation of art is not so easy. So Cezanne says, the landscape thinks itself in me, he would say, and I am its consciousness. There is a fundamental, vital engagement between Cezanne and the landscape he's depicting. Because, and again, there's a lot of, even later on with Deleuze, even Henri Bergson, which I'll get into maybe a little bit with that essay, on English painting, like the Vorticists and so forth, that he is speaking the language of the natural world as it is meant through this, how should I say it, uncorrupted by the sort of conscious criticism of what looking into a landscape is through the perspective of art history, for instance, through the perspective of the human as such, the Western man, its full presence. Rather, he is saying, no, I am the multitude of nature that speaks through me. That I am depicting the object in a way that goes beyond mere depiction. That it is saying that its consciousness is that of totality, that of this vitalistic engagement. That he is saying that I'm going to represent all perspectives around that landscape, around that tree, around that piece of fruit. That I'm going to represent it in such a way that the objects in the surrounding life world of that object, that everything around it is going to be that thing. That it will come forth. The tree will come forth out of all the other trees. Because I've depicted what is around it. And so that's such a powerful statement when Cezanne says, the landscape thinks itself in me, he would say, and I am its consciousness. Nothing can be farther from naturalism in this intuitive science. Art is not imitation, nor is something manufactured according to the wishes of instinct or good taste. It is a process of expression. But in a weird way, Cezanne takes imitation. He's not imitating per se. He is giving objects back to themselves. He's going back to the things themselves. He is saying that the object will shine forth in its life world, in that position, in that particular spot in the landscape. That tree will live around the other trees in a grove, around the roots to its base, that it will be submerged in its life world. And that he is expressing that relationship, that integral verb, that life force around that tree. He's not really imitating. He's not saying, well, you know, because the principles of perspective and because of, there's been a lot of studies on trees that artists have read. I have one of these books in particular that talk about the anatomy of trees. And there's rules of composition that can make these relationships of rendering that object in the work of art much easier. And a lot of artists will just fall back on those principles. If the history of landscape is the history of it being a background, of not really mattering until quite recently. And there's parts of the landscape, for example, in a lot of Renaissance painters, in Titian, where the landscape is quite brilliant, but it's just a backdrop. The only artist that can really say that you can compare Cezanne to would be Poussin. Because Poussin, or de Chauvenet, because both Poussin and Chauvenet, they depict figures and they depict these mythical allegories as if they are sunken into the landscape. That there's color choices, rules of composition that factor in these figures. These mythological figures, these very hidden, subtle allegories and symbolisms that Poussin would depict. But you look at them, and like in literati painting, with these sparse little figures here and there, the figure is consumed by the totality of that landscape. The activity of people are represented in such a way as if the landscape is just as important as the figures, as the mythological motifs, as those little symbols that were hidden that nobody can quite figure out. Like that one painting by Poussin in particular. I think Bronze Age Pervert actually, he tweeted about it once. It's like, what are they saying to each other? There's this one painting by Chauvenet, The Peasants in Their Sleep, that was originally taking a mythological motif about the dangers of sleep. I think it was it during the Peloponnesian War? I forget. But the peasants, they're all huddled up against each other. There's sort of like a weird polyamory going on between them, although none of them are naked. But after work, they're sleeping by these haystacks on the moonlight. And there's different compositions that Chevanet would do, but the one that people know, when you look at it, the figures are similar to the rocks or the hay bales that they're sleeping next to. So in a way, it's a figurative work. But those figures are, and again, you could read some kind of like weird Marxoid social realism into it, that the peasantry is just close to nature, and they're close to the land, they're close to their use value. But beyond that, just the immediate impression of that painting by Chevanet is that the peasantry that have done their work for the day, that are sleeping in the moonlight together next to each other, huddled for warmth, is that they are naturalistic objects that are no different than their surroundings. The trees, the river that the moonlight's bouncing off of, the bales of hay, the rocks, that they take on a naturalistic form. And Poussin did this as well. If you look at all his figurative works, they kind of have a different vibe than a lot of figurative works in the Renaissance, where the landscape is sort of like a second order thing, is just a backdrop. It's like basically a stage play for the genre painting that's going on. So similarly, Cezanne is like another evolution of that. Now everything is together. Everything is an amalgamation of immediate perceptions. So you'd have to like go around Mount Vitor, and he had to look at it multiple times. And then he would say, yes, now I have that motif, that impression, that conglomeration of impressions that I'm going to paint. And it would take him hours. Because how do you paint that? Similarly to, again, like the non-site essay that I'm going to read. Like literati painting in China. You gotta realize that the Chinese ink painters, they didn't do plein air. They would meditate. They would do their own ritualistic practices. Now, it wasn't Zen Buddhism wasn't around at this time. It was Chan Buddhism, but they did have like their own little form of what the ritualistic practice you could call Zerzan, right? But because Chan Buddhism is when Bodhidharma went to the East. And some like crazy people like that one guy that doesn't like me, the one schizo, he believes that Bodhidharma was an Iranian. Oh my God, I gave it away who it is. Anyways, never mind. Who cares about e-drama? I'm not going to pollute Content Minded with e-drama anymore. I promise you. I wasn't going to do that. But anyways, when Bodhidharma took basically proselytized Buddhism, the Chinese were equipped to it because the Chinese were amalgamated to it, or rather acclimatized to it, because they had Taoism. And Chan Buddhism is like this weird mix between Buddhism from India and Taoism. And then from that, you have in Japan, you have Zen Buddhism, right? So the Taoist literati painters, they weren't like doing drawings in nature. They didn't care about that. They weren't plein air painters. Now, there's some of them nowadays that do plein air painting, but what they were trying to do is that they were acclimatizing themselves. They were ritualistically submerging themselves in the presence, in the eternal presence of that landscape, of that mountain, that they would meditate on, that they would try to walk upon, like climb on, and have different angles of. And so by the time they were ready to paint that mountain, that river, that mountain, it becomes a source of ritual. They're painting the impression of it. They're painting that immediate sensuous. It's in Western language. It's kind of hard to describe. They're sort of painting what's not there. That's how they're doing it. Like if you've read the Tao Te Ching, it's very in the principles of painting, in literati painting, in Sumi ink painting, it's very similar. You're painting the absence. You're painting what's not there. What's not there is more important than what's there. Because they're trying to depict that vital engagement. Even the word vital is kind of like in Buddhism, it's a problematic term because it's like it implies some kind of like weird metaphysics that it's kind of hard to like escape Western language. But they're painting for, just for simplicity's sake, they're painting the élan vital. They're painting that life force of the landscape, of that one particular mountain, that one particular river that they've constantly meditated on, they've constantly looked at, they've looked at different angles of. But how do you depict those different angles without doing preparatory sketches in nature? You have to ingrain yourself into the consciousness of that landscape to such an extent that by the time the literati painters, the Taoist painters, actually painted the ink painting on silk, they were so attuned, it was an attunement to that one particular image, that a few brushstrokes could do it. And I know I'm like mythologizing it, but like, it's hard to differentiate because it's like when Westerners learned about this stuff, you had like a lot of grifters that would try to do this like mystical woo-woo stuff, especially during the New Age movement and so forth. But let's say, they're so attuned to that landscape that they can depict it from memory and from sensation. From the sensation of those repeated, constant, different perceptions and engagements with that landscape. They can do it. No preparatory plein air sketch required. In fact, that would just defeat the point. Because that's only one moment that you're depicting. Now, I do plein air. I love plein air. It's basic artistic practice. Especially if you're a landscape painter. But that's only one moment. It's not depicting the totality. It's not depicting that verve, that élan vital, that vital force. And so that's why the literati painters, they didn't really do preparatory sketches. They didn't really do plein air. Because they realized limitations of that. Because what's absent from the landscape that you are depicting, it's contradictory, but if you look at a Chinese landscape, you'll get what I mean. It's the negative space that suggests forms that go on forever. And that's what's really important. So let's take a little bit of music break. Let's enjoy some Philip Daniel compositions, and then we'll get back to this essay that I kind of don't want to read because it's some it's some lib trying to talk about the social consciousness of Cezanne. He was a terrible reactionary. But we'll get to it. It's not that bad. It's actually quite a good essay. I'm actually curious as to reading this guy's book. But anyways, hit it. Back. Hopefully that was an enjoyable number by my good friend Philip Daniel. So this is an article that I don't know how I came across this. I think because someone mentioned Cezanne and I was looking into his politics. So this is called Cezanne's Withdrawal. It's by Saul Nelson, who has, I believe, this year published a book about what was it about? It's about like modernist painting and anti-modernism. It looks kind of interesting, but then I read this article and then I'm like, maybe, And this is from New Left Review, December 2022, a few years ago. And it's, what is it called? Sidecar, which is like their culture stuff, you know. But I didn't know the New Left Review is still going. It's quite, they've been around for quite a while. So, wasn't all the Frankfurt School people associated with New Left Review? Or something like that. But they've been around for like quite a while. So, British bi-monthly journal covering world politics, economy. Yeah, it just makes sense. I think this guy is British. Established in 1960. Number of new journals emerged, carry commentary matters of Marxist theory. And I believe there was some kind of Frankfurt stuff. Well, you know, I mean, it was full of new left people. And the most powerful description was gone wrong Western societies, according to Christopher Caldwell. So, anyways, that's beside the point. But it is an interesting article, nevertheless. So this is called Cezanne's Withdrawal. Saul Nelson. The last painting you see as you leave Tate Modern Cezanne's retrospective is 3 skulls on a patterned carpet from 1904, which is the later Cezanne. Done 2 years before the artist's death. It is dark and oppressive, literal in its preoccupations. The 3 skulls speak of death and interiority, of subject mediation, meditating on the limits of human life. The carpet which rises all around them, high Victorian with its illusionistic red flowers and brownish folds, is fecundly embodied, all blooming and dying. The painting thematizes a split, ever present in Cezanne. So, of course, I mean, this is similar to the works that Van Gogh painted before the end of his life as well. The painter making the painting, and of human beings whose skulls these once were, and the longer durée of material time, the time of solid objects and raw matter, during which our skulls will endure when we do not. The flesh that covers them will recede, the force and intelligence that move them will vanish, but our bones will live on in a different rhythm. Skulls, in other words, are like paintings. They outlast their original owners. It is marvelous to see the thick, bald paint that still stands off the contours of the left 2 skulls 100 years and more after they were painted. These are morbid thoughts, and he goes into the history of Cezanne. Certainly the painting, so let me skip ahead about, you know, Saint Victoire, done from a studio roof. So then he says, the painting is a memento mori, done in the tradition of Cezanne's heroes Titian and Poussin. But we should ask what the difference is between such a painting, done by an aged Cezanne as the 20th century dawned, and those of painters on whom he drew. What was death's social content at this point in history of modernism? Oh, it's always about social content, right? I mean, I know, I understand, but like sometimes I roll my eyes when, well... answering such questions requires knowledge of where Cezanne was coming from, of the artistic traditions in which he drew, and of society in which he lived, the norms and expectations of the modernizing France bourgeois that come under such pressure in his paintings. Such considerations are well served by the hanging arrangements in the Tate show. So then he goes on the Bathers, Mount Victoire. Room 2 hangs some of the great landscapes. So it's describing the show, but let me go to the good parts. Look where the left-handed woman's left leg. So this is L'Esprit Midi, the battle spoke to a weaker strain in Cezanne's painting. The Baroque contours, contortions, and involutions with which his inner visions presented themselves to his mind. Baroque contortions is not a bad term for what is going on in L'Après-Midi. The 2 figures embrace so closely that their bodies almost fuse. That's all. Well, again, almost like the Kiss by Edvard Munch. Look where the left-hand woman's left leg and back meet the right leg of her androgynous companion. How they seem to issue from a single body, united by her loose black plate. Attraction and revulsion are mingled here, and attached to the naked human form in a manner that is further allegorized by the wrestling or coupling figures in the battle of love. And you see it, there's a lot of sensuous parts if you actually look at it. The painting... They are kind of like weirdly together. They could be in a wrestling pose. There's some parts that are quite garish and off-putting, but there's also parts, especially the one woman that he's painting with, quite attention to the sort of the vibe of her flesh itself. But again, it's very much he's trying to like implode the perspective in some ways. There's like chair off to the side. Fry could never muster much affection for such ambiguities. He preferred the order architectural design achieved in Cezanne's images of the external world, landscapes and still life in particular. It's a nice touch to see Fry's notebooks displayed next to still life with fruit dish. He diligently rectilinear sketches, his diligent rectilinear sketches and exciting handwriting convey the breathlessness of his attempt to comprehend the sheer novelty of what he was seeing. The words he found, words for Cezanne's muteness and impenetrability, his bizarre conservative politics, the tragic, menacing, noble, or lyrical side of his art. And this is, of course, the notes that were written by the art historian Roger Fry, commenting on Cezanne. So, quote, tragic, menacing, noble, or lyrical side of his art and his repeated efforts at synthesis. These go on resonating, but the gap between sketches on the page and the canvas on the wall is glaring. Fry's drawings are neat and orderly. They reflect his conviction that logic and synthesis were the painting's ultimate results. Cezanne's painting, on the other hand, fairly pulses with sickly illumination. The blue wallpaper flowers take on life of their own. I can never escape the impression that the back wall is no wall at all but sky. Blue seeps around the objects and makes the yellow and red highlights on the apples blaze brighter. And of course, yeah, that's basic, complementary colors. Moving on from the actual fantasies of paintings like La Prise Midi and the Battle of Love to Cezanne's more innocuous subjects help us discern the mingled presence of desire, uncertainty, and fear in both. Take the two paintings. Oh, is this doing a psychoanalysis of Cezanne? The Bay of Marseille scene from L'Assigue that hangs side by side in room 5. The first was done in 1878 to 89 and usually hangs in the Musée d'Orsay. The other is most likely from 1885 and comes from the Art Institute of Chicago. Both meditate on the painter's desire to fix the view before him into comprehensible form, to have it add up, and the failures and frustrations implicit in that attempt. So again, this goes back to his doubt of trying to achieve a synthesis of immediate apprehensions and perceptions, or I should say sensations and perceptions rather than apprehension as such. Because apprehension kind of does imply a second order thing. The splendid ridge of deep, scrubby green that descends from left to right in the Orsay painting encapsulates this feeling. It is broken in the center by odd pairings of a tiny, dun-colored house and a tree with an ochre canopy. The house is bright and inhuman, with the merest ghost of a window. The tree is bizarre, thrusting up from all greens, haloed in blue and white. It is dead, redacted by some blight that would carry off its dry leaves. It is no tree at all, but a puff of smoke from the chimney stack directed below, or the tree viewed through smoke. So again, there's this mingling of forms that Cezanne is doing that comes about from the immediate first look impression of that scene. Like when you see, is that really just chimney smoke? Is it chimney smoke that's obscuring trees? But to Cezanne, the way he's painting it, whereas, for example, a lot of other impressionists, Monet did this all the time, by the way, where there would be like smokestacks from a train or from a house. He would paint them separately. And he would try to create, and most painters do this, you're trying to create a harmonious and uncluttered composition. But Cezanne says, if I'm smoke mingling with the tree, then I'm going to paint it. So, in a way, the tree leaves mingle together with the smoke. So let me go on. So there are fruits of sustained looking. In the Chicago picture, smoke streams from another chimney as blue-gray scrawl, synodach, how do I say that? Syndoche for the power and deficiencies of the painter's brush. Form is fixed only to endlessly unravel. And of course, you have in this article the Bay of Marseille, which was painted in 1879. And this is where Cezanne, he's starting to turn the landscape. There's still perspective. There's a lot of aerial perspective. Of course, the lake and the surrounding mountains, they're still painted in a bluer hue. But you start to notice that there's a lot of mingling together of the foreground and the background. This is where Cezanne is starting to sort of cross over into pure seeing. The questions posed in such passages is this: what if an image of the world won at the greatest cost, at the greatest proximity, returns as something ungraspable? What if knowledge at close range adds up to confusion? The view across the Bay of Marseille as the opposite shore speaks to this fear. In both paintings, distance has ironed out the particularities of the foreground, but at the cost of all lived particularities. It is as if in order to understand the scene, the painter has to destroy it. The shadow that wreak havoc in the foreground of the Chicago painting has been pushed right off the hills onto the other side of the bay. They balance on top of them like rakish hats. The diagonal ridge tinged green that run down the bay's far shore on the right of the Orsay painting reads like an answer to the broken diagonal in the foreground with its smoking trees. Nothing living breaks its surface. Its rationality is chilling. The painting at l'Astque are typical of Cezanne's mature landscapes. We can never get a grip on them. The space they offer for imaginative participation is always either too close or too far away. Something similar happens in the still lifes, of which the shadow contains an astonishing selection. A single wall in room 7 is worth the price of entry alone. It holds 2 versions of still life with plaster Cupid from the Korthal in London and the National Museum in Stockholm. So again, in other words, it's very hard to penetrate these landscapes because they're not the sort of Edenic, sensuous colored landscapes that you'd find in other impressionists. You almost can't imagine yourself in them in a lot of ways. All were done between 1893 and 1895. The family estate where Cezanne moved after the death of his father, at the Jasson de Buffon. The sheer range of effects achieved across contemporaneous paintings with similar, often identical subject matter is remarkable. Just look at the shift in atmosphere between the Met's still life and the Getty's, how 2 paintings in which blue is the dominant note, the blue of the walls, of air, of fabric, of the stalwart ginger jar, make such different material out of the same color. The form is icy, the latter suffused with the green that seems to emanate from the melon's bowling ball's surface. Look at the different kinds of disorientation achieved in the 2 Cupids. Space in the Korthal painting is tipped and tilted. The Cupid rocked on its table, the canvas is stacked against the wall, and the buckling floor that rises up almost parallel with the picture plane describes a mad architecture. Yeah, it almost does seem surreal. The perspective is like completely out the window. And this sort of distortion of perspective is what you would see in later surrealism as well. The Cupid's mutilation reads more clearly from this angle. Whole patches of canvas poke through its plaster face. Splitting across the table, its folds twisted up into a clam's mouth, the blue fabric acquires an eerie vitality. So it's true, if you actually look at the Cupid painting, the blue, it's almost like, okay, and I can't believe he would know this because photography wasn't that popular. I mean, there was photographs of Cezanne, but it wasn't like mass-produced as it is now. When you have like a sort of crappy digital shot of something, and it's like the perspective is turned, or it's like on an angle that you have to like straighten out the photo in an editor, the blue fabric is like that. The blue fabric is all of the holding these balls of fruit, and it's unclear if they're oranges or melons or whatever. It's like the fabric is lurching onto the painting, and it's in equal parallel to Cupid, but the table's running off up to the foreground of the painting, and you have this like weird curvature. It's almost as if Cezanne is painting a sort of angle where when you're doing a still life, and I've done very few still lifes, I'm more of like a landscape person. It's like you're trying to even out those angles. You're trying to position your body or position the sort of display, the tableau of different objects in such a way as to create a harmonious picture. But Cezanne doesn't really care about that. He's just painting it from that angle where he's sitting at the time. And so he's creating these like weird distortions of the table and of perspective itself. So, to read on, there's a time where the effect of such painting, the way they have at once framing a scene with dazzling immediacy and rendering it alien and incomprehensible, were read in terms of autonomy. Like Cezanne himself leaving behind theater subject matter and Paris salons for the peasants and the produce of all, these paintings would draw. They are dense, negative in particular. This negativity seemed to answer the question of their modernity. And this is where this is why I wanted to read this article. Their negativity seems to answer the question of their modernity. How is it that this most innovative of painters, a beacon into generations of subsequent modernists, could have assembled his greatest achievements from such defiantly pre-modern subject matter? Turning from modernity and revulsion, seeking more, and of course this guy thinks that's bad. That's reactionary. Seeking more and more extreme models of refusal. The painting registered modernity's effects with unprecedented sensitivity. Because remember, that's true. This distortion of perspective, if you look at the history of modernist painting after Cezanne, Cezanne is like ground zero. If you don't have Cezanne, you don't have Braque, you don't have Picasso, you don't even have Salvador Dali. When you really think about it. I mean, maybe you have Salvador Dali because Raphael existed, but you know what I mean. You don't have Frankenthaler, you don't have Franz Klein, you don't have, even right up into the contemporary moment, you don't have the young British artists even. I mean, a lot of people were like, oh man, that's great. Then maybe if, would you go back in time and redact Baby Cezanne? A lot of trads are going to be like, oh, that's great, But the point being is, if you look at the logical development, bracket your criticism of modern art for a second. If you look at the genealogy of modern art, if there was no Cezanne, there would be no Picasso. There would be no modern art movements. The way that we there wouldn't even be surrealism in some ways. Although surrealism, they did take, I'm not that well acquainted with surrealism, but they took from other traditions. A lot of them were very inspired by Renaissance painters, by the Baroque. There's this weird connection between the Spanish Baroque and then later Surrealists. But when it comes to modernism proper, Cezanne is such a huge influence because of the way that he played fast and loose with perspective, with brushstrokes, with color tone, with color theory, and so forth. So turning from modernity and revulsion, seeking more and more extreme models of refusal, the paintings register modernity's effects with unprecedented sensitivity. This has been one answer to the biographical problem of Cezanne's later political sympathies. Oh, the problem of them. It has to be a problem. But the thing is, you'll see later on the article, because this is the New Left Review, right? So, you know what you're getting. That Nelson, he says, oh, it's a problem, and how come there's like this two dissonant things between Cezanne's modernist painting and his very like tradcath reactionary lifestyle and political opinions? No, but I say that there's no contradiction. That one leads to the other. Because Cezanne is doing something very pre-modern, very primitivist. Not in this sort of like kind of quasi-folky primitivism of someone like Gauguin, but as much as I like and respect Gauguin, but to me, it's not so much a problem. It's sort of like a form of reactionary modernism. I know, I said the line, I said the title of the stream. Not stream, what am I talking about? The title of the podcast. So, but let me read, then I'll get into the analysis a bit more. This has been one answer to the biographical problem of Cezanne's later political sympathies, his mistrust for revolutionary politics, his anti-Dreyfusism. He was a Dreyfus truther. The Dreyfus did it. That he had certain problems of loyalty that sold secrets to the Germans. I remember I had this argument in a DM group with Christopher Sandbach. He said that Dreyfus actually was loyal, even though of his certain ethnic character, he still was loyal to France. Now, I don't know I don't know if I'm like a total the Dreyfus affair, if people recall. I don't know if I'm a total Dreyfus truther. I mean, Dreyfus did seem like a model soldier, and there was that other ethnically German soldier that had a monetary incentive to sell secrets to the Germans before World War One. But I don't know. But Cezanne was a Dreyfus truther, whereas he tanked his friendship with Emile Zola over it. So his increasingly conservative Catholicism, none of it mattered if the art itself registered a different set of aesthetic and political commitments. Fry put it this way. So this Nelson, this art critic, is castigating Roger Fry for saying that, well, you can separate the art and the artist. But of course, like a typical, Reddit soyjack leftoid argument, it's like, no, you can't do that. And I can't believe there's this dissonance, but we'll see. But if you recall, this is an article from the New York Times, the New York Lies, I believe in the early 90s. This is a letter to the editor on August 25th, 1991. I wasn't born. It was a year before I was born. Well, almost 2 years, actually. That Cezanne distanced himself from Emile Zola. In John Russell's essays, The Poet Who Started a Stalled Cezanne, the reference to Cezanne having been abandoned by Emile Zola, his lifelong friend and supporter, is true as far as it goes. It might have gone a bit further, though, and reveal why the coolness developed between the author Jacques and the anti-Dreyfusard painter. If Zola deservedly lived in the history of literature as the author of such classic novels as Germinal and Nana, The Haunting Asmeur, he has also won the place in the pantheon of modern history for his fight to expose the frame-up of Alfred Dreyfus and also to save the honor of France, both aim to achieve with the aim of Jacques. I disagree. Because Dreyfus was being defended by the libtards in France at the time. Whereas the nationalists in France, the right-wing nationalists, they were anti-Dreyfusards. And so Cezanne, what he did was clever. He did like the optics check thing, where he sort of like slowly distanced himself from all of these other painters that wanted to act as activists. And I hate to say it, Monet was also included. Well, let me read the letter. Captain Dreyfus and Emile Zola were not without painter's support in the Dreyfus affair. The Dreyfusards included not only Zola's other close friends Monet and Pissarro, but also Mary Cassatt, Signac, Voltaire, and Lucé. Most of the better-known Impressionist painters were anti-Dreyfus. They included Cezanne, Degas, Renoir, and Rodin. All the based and red-pilled people accused of misogyny. 100 years later, they accused Renoir and Degas of misogyny. So all the based Impressionists and post-impressionists, they were anti-Dreyfusards. And of course, all the, Mary Cassatt, of course. I had this debate. I was in the museum. I had this debate with my GF about this one painting where it was very funny. It was very funny. As a side note, it was this one painting by Mary Cassatt. It was these two women, absent of the male gaze, and one of them is in this pleasure garden reaching for an apple. And the other woman, her dress is very well done. And my GF was talking about how Edenic it looked, and that it was sort of like a reversal of that mythology, where now you just have, you have Eve and maybe Lilith taking the apple, female agency. And then, of course, I immediately started dropping, sneed posting, dropping, spilling spaghetti, dropping red pills. That, this is just like bourgeois femininity trying to recreate this Edenic thing. And that really, it was basically like this upper middle class woman in a pleasure garden. And then it's very funny. Like she goes, Gio, look around. We just saw a Beta Kuhn exhibit. They're all upper middle class bourgeois women. It doesn't matter. Don't do this vulgar trad, MAGA communist class analysis. It was very funny. Very, very funny. I mean, okay, Mary Cassatt did paint scenes that were Edenic in a way. But anyways, this is a side note. I just thought the story was very funny. Cezanne was not like Degas and Renoir, outspokenly and bitterly anti, you know what. Whatever his reasons, he did not, like Monet, sign the manifesto of the intellectuals that called for freeing Dreyfus. The truth was that Cezanne abandoned Zola over the Dreyfus affair, and Zola never attacked Cezanne. He merely kept his distance. It's sort of like when you have a friend that libtards out, it's like, what are you going to do? It's like, you don't attack me, I won't attack you. There's people I know on the TL that I do this with, you know? Cezanne's anti-Dreyfus position did not diminish Zola's admiration for his painting. It did, however, diminish Cezanne's stature as a man and one-time friend. All Alan Chase, New York, from 91. And of course, this made Cezanne an anathema. Because Cezanne, you could say, I know I'm being like a conservative or whatever here, but he was like one of the first instances of art cancellation. When you really think about that. You know, I know, I sound like Ethan Ralph. If you want to know the truth about it, Cezanne was canceled if you want to know the truth about it, bitch. But anyways, no, it's true. I joke, but it's true though. So Fry puts it this way in this quote: "At the bottom, the strange man who seemed in life to be an exasperated innocence, this man who read nothing but the Catholic daily paper, trusted always to the Pope for direction, and believed all the reassuring plausibilities of the social and intellectual reaction, had nonetheless a great intellect where his own passion was concerned, in whatever affected his art. And this is where we get the last few parts of this essay. The contemporary art world no longer has much tolerance for this kind of argument. We do not insulate art from the world around it, man. We want our artists to share our politics. Oh boy. Yeah, do you want your artists to share your politics, right? Because God forbid, artists of the contemporary art world share my politics, but whatever. Their life should be exemplary. Yeah, their life should be... that's such a crazy statement considering a lot of great artists throughout history were like absolute terrible people and degenerates and so forth, and total social pariahs. Their life should be exemplary. The Tate Show makes no mention of Cezanne's later opinions. Oh, God forbid they have a retrospective on one of the most important artists who have ever lived, and they don't mention his problematic opinions, right? Instead, in room 3, titled Radical Times, the curator attempts to unsettle the image of an isolated reactionary. There's the word, isolated reactionary, pursuing his art in denial of wider society. They make the case for a man whose paintings, at least in his youth, responded to progressive causes. Oh, here we go. And here comes the race idolatry. Scipio, 1866 to 1868, depicts a half-clothed black man, a model of the same name at the Académie Suzy, about whom little else is known. Cezanne has shown him seated, eyes shut, resting on a white sheet with arms thrown forward. It is a beautiful painting, muscled like a Mannerist nude, a figure studying an exhaustion that draws clearly on prototypes developed in the imagery of abolitionism. The American Civil War had barely ended. Slavery in French dominions was a non-too-distant memory. It is fascinating to see Cezanne's responding sympathetically to the discourse. Oh, but he became more of a conservative later on, and that really deflated you, right? But one needs to ask what the interest in racial justice briefly gained was so quickly lost. Why do the great paintings of the following decades shed the signs of human struggle? I mean, Cezanne was struggling himself to depict nature. Is that not enough for you? Oh, I'm sorry. It has to have LGBT by POC communism. That's the real struggle, from which no other struggle can be gained or mentioned. What was the character of this loss? This withdrawal, accompanied as it was by an art of unprecedented aesthetic boldness. Was it flight from the modern world, from its horrors and its challenges, or a confrontation with some of its deepest implications? Yeah, in that way, I think Cezanne was kind of a visionary, right? He just said, oh, wow, I guess this is the way things are going. So I have to try to find a way to still be in time, but not of time, if that makes sense. To sort of bracket this character of modernity as a whole. But, you know, in a way, Cezanne's paintings are untimely in that sense. And here's the last paragraph. At stake here is the character of Cezanne's withdrawal. What was lost and what was achieved? One answer to this is given by the treatment of death in Three Skulls. The two paintings that hang near at the end of the Tate show, Still Life with Apples and Peaches, Still Life with Ginger, Jar, Sugar Bowl, and Oranges, 1902-06. In each, the blue that suffused the whole moment of Cezanne's still lifes had been all but extinguished. The shutters are closed, the outside world banished, touches of blue remain on the creases of the cloth or the highlights of a piece of fruit. But the overwhelming tones are the browns of the wall and the reds of the patterned carpet. The sense of loss is overpowering. The world collapses to the dimensions of an interior. Fruit has turned rust-colored. Death appears in these paintings as a withdrawal into the private sphere. A shuttering up of the artist in his grand house with his beloved objects. In the process, the whole tragedy of modern capitalism, the whole tragedy of modern capitalism, which is Cezanne's grand theme, the myth of the private individual, the demolition of nature, the erosion of public life, the death of Europe's peasantry, comes into a new focus. The skull and the table are no generic memento mori, they're our ancestors. Okay, there's a reality to that, but there's also something kind of like leftoid cope in that last statement. So let's tackle that last statement as it is, right? Thank you for listening to the Content Minded podcast. If you wish to support me and listen to every episode in full, then please go to patreon.com/giantartproductions and substack.com/Gio's Content Corner. There you will find the full archive of every Content Minded episode, as well as every Giant Art Review episode, and exclusive to all patrons, the weekly Cole Report, where I break down interesting stories and discourse from throughout the week. Subscribe today to keep the content renaissance alive.